Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me in another of my wonderful interviews. As you can see, I am on location and I have a guest. I've been sent this wonderful book called Postcapitalism, the alternative or an alternative to the Great Reset, something that we've been discussing, what the powers that be want to change our lives. And it's by Alasdair Lord. Hello, Alasdair.
Hello, Richard.
Thank you for agreeing to see me and welcoming into your
My pleasure.
Current place of residence, shall we say?
Yes.
So this book, Postcapitalism, is looking beyond capitalism and giving us some ideas. Before we get into that, you're clearly an author, and here is your book, and we're going to discuss some of that. Who else are you?
Okay, so my name's Alasdair Lord. On YouTube, I post videos as the Renaissance Yorkshireman. I was an English language teacher for 25 years. So I worked in Thailand for about 8 years, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Spain, teaching foreign students English. In the last few years, I've mostly been teaching Chinese students for British universities online. And I mean, I've been interested in the kind of questions of, capitalism and other alternative systems, because when I was young, I wasn't really happy with capitalism and I was a bit of a lefty, but at the same time, I could see that they weren't really putting forward solutions to the problems that we face. So at some point I just thought, right, well, I'm just going to write my own solution.
Right.
And started doing a lot of reading and I'd been to university. So, I'd studied a lot of these kind of economic issues.
So you're a clever man.
I like to think so.
Well-travelled, which is great.
Well-travelled.
So, okay, let's just go and think about capitalism, because most people think of capitalism, the alternative to capitalism is communism.
Right.
And I know that we spoke this before we started filming and referenced Churchill, who, and I'm going to misquote him because I don't know the exact way he put it, but capitalism is a bad system, but it's the best that we've got, or words to that effect.
Right, right.
So when you're then saying, well, hang on a minute, that there are other ways, there's a post-capitalism. What do you mean by that? Right,
well, I think a lot of people understand that capitalism and communism are opposites.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, they're two sides of the same coin, because they're both kind of materialist, reductionist ideas. And they're both quite kind of atheistic. They don't take into account, like the human spirit, I would say. Now, you can quite easily make the argument that capitalism is more functional than communism, and I think that's true. But at the same time, there are millions of people living in poverty here in the UK, let alone, developing countries. And we have so many environmental problems, because in the study of capitalist economics, economists use this model that they call Homo economicus. Now, basically, Homo economicus is trying to maximize his utility in the world. He's trying to make as much profit as possible without regard to anything else.
And we see that with so many businesses that seem to put money first rather than people.
Yes.
And if you're one of the customers of, say, a utility company, we're so aware that we are numbers now. And you'd think that the company was there for your benefit, but it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be all driven about profit, which seems, in many ways, anti-human.
Yes. So this idea of Homo economicus, essentially, he's a sociopath. And if you base your models on a sociopath, don't be surprised when you get sociopathic systems. And don't be surprised when companies act in a sociopathic way, because from their point of view, what they're doing is logical.
Right.
They're just following just following the dictates of the market, and they're maximizing profits for their shareholders. And if you have that logic, it doesn't matter if you're destroying the countryside. It doesn't matter if you're treating your workers really badly, because those things are secondary or very low down the list.
So do you think that the CEOs of companies, although they are paid very well and earn a lot of money out of this, do they not think about how, as their business grows and they buy up more businesses, that they are damaging the planet and using up resources, which eventually might actually mean that those businesses can no longer operate because the rare or raw resources are no longer there?
Well, that's an interesting question. And in some cases, I think the CEOs of these companies are quite psychopathic and narcissistic people. So they just don't give a shit. But I don't think that's always true. I think that many of them, it's like they've climbed the ladder and they get to a certain point and they understand the system and they would rather not be damaging the environment. But they're thinking, well, I've got shareholders and I need to maximize profit for those shareholders. And if it goes 2 or 3 quarters where the company's losing money, I may well get the boot, and they'll just bring someone else in who'll follow the same set of rules and the same kind of logic. So it's not that all CEOs of all companies are evil or psychopathic, although I think some of them are. But many of them, they're kind of trapped within the system. The system is there, and they're making logical decisions within the system that exists.
So shareholders, in the way I look at capitalism, when you get into these big companies, shareholders are the drivers of, because they want their money out of it. They seem to be driving the business rather than the customer, which is what the original business was presumably set up for, as well as the employees and the team at the top. How would you reorganize it then in a post-capitalistic system so that it's actually, you can run a business and a successfully large business, but you're doing good rather than doing bad?
Okay, well, that's a complicated answer with lots of different parts. So I think first we've got to start with the basics, ethics and such like. So I'd like to talk about the 5 capitals framework.
Okay, 5 capitals framework.
The 5 capitals framework. So a lot of people who've studied economics, and even people who haven't, have heard about the idea of land, labour and capital. So this is the idea that this is what you need for production. You need land to build factories or to grow crops. You need labour, you need people, and you need money to get things going, to buy equipment. So the 5 capitals framework is, it comes from that original model of land, labour and capital, but it's been developed over the years. Now, I would argue that capitalism, the ordering of the 5 capitals framework is incorrect. And if we reorder the 5 capitals framework, we can get functional, reasonably egalitarian systems. I mean, things are never going to be completely egalitarian, but more egalitarian than they are today.
So well, before you reorder them, what would you say is the order that it's currently in?
Okay. So the order that I would say that capitalism orders the 5 capitals framework at the moment is: number 1 is financial capital. Number 5 is human capital. Number 5 is social capital. And in the middle, and you could argue about the order of the middle 3.
Right.
But I would say probably manufactured capital, natural capital, and human capital.
And what do you mean by social capital?
Okay, so social capital, which, as I say in capitalism, is ranked number 5, the last.
Right.
This is the relationships within a society. But it's also, how things like local government run. But really, it's about relationships. So it's about functional families. It's about functional communities.
And that's right at the bottom.
I would argue in capitalism, yes, it's right at the bottom.
Yeah, and I think many people probably would agree that the social side of business is, and we're not talking about the parties and things that people go to, or the extracurricular activities, but how it impacts the social society that we live in.
Yeah.
is at the bottom.
Yes, and financial capital is top.
Right.
Now, the thing about financial capital, money, shares, whatever other things. Now, it's been made deliberately complicated by economists and by bankers. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. One is that it can then facilitate corrupt transactions, drug dealing, arms trading. When it's really complicated, it's difficult to follow the way that money moves. Whereas when it's simple and straightforward, it's easy to track. So it has been deliberately made complicated by bankers and economists.
So how would you reorder these 5 capitals?
Okay, so the order that I say they should be in for a post-capitalist system is number 1, natural capital, because planet Earth comes first. If we don't have a healthy environment, we cannot thrive as human beings.
Right.
Now, second and third, I would put human and social capital. Now, sometimes human capital second and social capital third, sometimes the other way around, because they're very much intertwined. So as an example of social capital, in my own case, human capital is about the skills that you have as an individual.
Yeah.
So in my own case, I could drive a car. That's part of my human capital. I can speak fluent Spanish and I speak fluent Thai. Because I've been a teacher, I've got certain skills for organising classrooms and deciding, how to teach a lesson. So it's all these kind of skills that you have as an individual. So human and social capital second and third, manufactured capital fourth, and at the bottom, financial capital.
Right, okay. Well, that makes sense. The question, I suppose, and I may come back to this on some of the points that we go through in the book, is how do you do that? How will you take a company that is making millions and doesn't give a hoot about the people on the ground, knowing that they'll buy their product if they perform in a certain way and almost and dominate the market? How do you change that order so that it is more about us as people and less about the profit?
Well, again, that's a very complicated question with many different parts. Now, some of these parts are psychological.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
That's why I'm asking, because you've got the book, you see.
So some of these parts are psychological, right? No doubt. Because we have to reimagine a new system. Now, the problem that most critics of capitalism have, in my view, is they come in at the middle. They're not really looking at the basic building blocks. Now, I would argue that the basic building block of financial capital, as it currently exists today, are debt-based currencies.
Yeah.
Now, we have to get rid of debt-based currencies. There is no solving the problems that humans face today without tackling debt-based currencies. So, would you like a little example of how it works?
Absolutely.
So, let's imagine I want to borrow some money from the bank because I want to start a business. Now, debt-based currency and fractional reserve banking go together. So let's say a private individual wants to start a bank and, he's gone through the proper paperwork and what have you, and the fractional reserve is 1/9. What that means is if he has £1,111.12, he can create £10,000 to lend.
Right.
Now, it sounds bizarre, but he just types that money into a computer and voila, it exists. So he creates £10,000 and lends it to me, but he lends it at 5% interest. So £10,000 has been created as cash money, but £10,500 has been created as debt. So there is never enough money in the system to repay all the debt, which is why, Britain is so heavily in debt. America owes trillions and trillions to private banks because most people imagine that the money supply is controlled by the government, and occasionally it is. In some countries it is. But the norm is that private banks create money and on behalf of the government, and that circulates in the economy. But when we create money with debt, the debt grows and grows, and it's like a cancer in the system. And cancer really is the correct word for this toxic system of debt-based currencies. So I would say the starting point, although there are many psychological issues to address, is to get rid of debt-based currencies. Create money without debt.
So we're in a strange situation in the UK and across the rest of the world. People have been trying to push this forward and we've been threatened with it. And that's the central bank digital currency, a program currency, which can actually influence how you buy things or whether you're allowed to buy things, which is a different system. And incidentally, I don't know what you feel about this. I've been told that if you've got a mortgage and CBDCs come in, if you acquiesce to agreeing to switch your mortgage to that, then you'll currently carry on paying it. But because the mortgage was originally in not pounds, shillings and pence, but in the fiat currency of sterling, let's say, and if you don't agree to it and they get rid of fiat currency, they've basically wiped off your mortgage.
Right.
Because you can't transfer one type of currency to another currency, apparently, which could be quite useful to some people. But anyway, so my point really was that if we're about to be switched to something, we are in a unique opportunity to say we don't have to have that switch. We could do, just as you've said, create a credit-based money system, which might come with a bit of reservation from those that want to control us. But what could they do to stop you? And let's avoid that question, because I'm sure they could do lots of things. But we potentially could do it.
Right. So the author that I've read and that I quote when I'm talking about money in my book is an economist called Thomas Greco. And he's written a number of works about alternative currencies. And there's lots of alternative local currencies that have been piloted around the world. So models have been created and used. Now, some of them work better than others. And, you know, we still need to kind of experiment to a certain degree. But the important points are they need to come under local control and they need to be, what's the right word? I was thinking clear, but transparent. They need to be transparent and they need to be under local control and they need to be created bearing no debt.
Right.
And one example that I write about in my book is copiosis. So copiosis is a system that was created by this American guy by the name of Perry Gruber. And what happens in the system of copiosis is, let's say you've got a carpenter and he creates some chairs and tables, right? Here we are. Here they are.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
Now, he is compensated for creating those when he creates them, and they become then like public property.
By whom?
By a payer organisation.
Right.
So this, so there would be a group of local people who have either been elected or selected locally, and people can put input, so they can decide, you know, a teacher's hour is worth more than a cleaner's hour, and a doctor's hour is worth more than a teacher's hour, you know. So there's a lot of room for deciding how much different people's hours should be valued. And the important point is, first of all, there's transparent discussion and people can input, and you would have like some kind of algorithm within this. Now, when someone wants to come and buy the table and chairs, their money is destroyed. So there's money being created and destroyed within this system. Whereas in our system, money's always being created, but the debt goes up as well.
Right. So this is different than, this would be a different system than, say, having a local where the money just stays in circulation in the locality. I mean, in the world that we're in, the money might go in there, but it seems to be sucked and disappeared altogether to big corporations and Swiss bank accounts and billionaires and individuals and what have you, and foundations and things where it can't get hold of again. So, but in an ordinary fair system where the money is just going around, you're saying that you would buy that there's a pool of money to begin with.
It's created.
Or it's created. things are made, people are compensated for the time and effort.
Yes, but because there's local input, some things would not be valued. So, for example, we could decide that creating Kalashnikovs
All right.
is not something that's valued by the local community. So that is not going to be compensated.
Right.
So then factories that create Kalashnikovs would probably choose to not create Kalashnikovs and perhaps create something else which is valued by the community.
So, because you've said that, one of the important things of a community would be to be able to protect itself from outside forces. So you might have a system in which you could create a certain number of these Kalashnikovs, let's say, or weapons of destruction, that everyone's agreed to keep for that one purpose, but they're not being made to be sold overseas to fund blackmailers or wars or anything like that.
Yes, that could be the case because it's decided locally.
Right.
Now, there's lots of different ways. Copiosis is one system, right? And I'm not saying it's the only system because there are many. So one thing that could be done is your local currency could be linked to a certain unit of energy, or it could be linked to a certain amount of silver or gold, right? Or they could be fiat currencies created with no physical backing. So there's lots of different ways it could work, but the important thing is that they remain under local democratic control,
Yeah.
and that they're transparent.
So again, I mean, this is I suppose the question that people will be thinking is, this sounds great, and we'd love to have that system, and I come back to that same point. How do we do it? Now I know, complicated thing, but so we can't keep coming back to that question because each one is complicated, and what we're doing, I suppose, is putting many answers on the table so that people have that as a resource to think there is a way to do this. Only, unless you go out and topple the people in charge who want that system.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a tricky one. Revolution or not revolution? I mean, if you look at the history of revolutions on planet Earth, Iranian Revolution, Russian Revolution, Mexican Revolution, what tends to happen is one group of psychopaths and narcissists replace a different group of psychopaths and narcissists. So, violent revolution doesn't generally solve problems. Now, I would argue, there needs to be a revolution of the mind. But I mean, here we're into, the nature of consciousness and, the human heart, and we're into a whole series of heart-centered questions rather than the practicalities of money.
Yeah.
But I think we need all of these things. We need to change the nature of money, and we need to have, a kind of a revolution of the mind and the heart. So I would argue that part of the solution to that is addressing trauma. So I don't know what percent of the planet's population are walking around suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I would be surprised if it was less than 10%. And in a country which has just undergone war, so Iraq, let's say, or Syria, I would say it's almost certainly higher than 10%. Now, how do you treat trauma? Well, if you go on YouTube and look for Dr. Ben Sessa, and MDMA is psychiatry's antibiotic, you can watch a 20-minute presentation by a doctor and psychiatrist, and he's saying that MDMA, which is commonly known, the street drug ecstasy is MDMA. Now, with MDMA and trauma, according to Dr. Ben Sessa, it has more or less around a 50% cure rate. Well, if you're addressing trauma with purely talk therapy, the cure rate's like 1%. I mean, it's the exception that people get cured.
Right.
It can help them manage it, but it doesn't cure it. But I mean, MDMA therapy or other therapies involving psilocybin, which there's a lot of research going on about these things at the moment, they're illegal. right? You know, they're not readily accessible
Yes.
in health systems. Now, you can argue about that, why that is. Now, I would argue that one of the reasons for that is because if you cure all these people of trauma, they're not going to then be accessing health systems, and, you know, pharmaceutical companies want customers to sell products to. And if you cure people of depression and trauma, they're going to lose a lot of money. So I would argue that that is one of the reasons.
And you're coming back there to the extremes of capitalism again. That
Yes,
you're,
yes.
You know, if you can keep the wheels on the bus falling off, somebody will always be making wheels.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I want to make the point that I don't consider myself an anti-capitalist. I consider myself a post-capitalist. Now, I think capitalism was a stage of development that humans needed to go through. And I don't think that communism is a viable alternative to capitalism. But we've reached the end of the system. You know, there are too many narcissistic psychopaths in positions of power in various governments around the world, high up as CEOs of companies, and the system can't carry on. Now, the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, calls what capitalism is mutating into, he calls it techno-feudalism. And I think he's right. So with techno-feudalism, it's things like central bank digital currencies, where the government know exactly what you're spending your money in, and privacy has ended. But it's also things like digital IDs. But if you have a central bank digital currency which expires after a certain time, then if you're not already wealthy, you will never be able to build any wealth.
Right.
So you will remain a part of this feudal peasant class. Now, some people who are non-property owners do all right from the system, but a lot of people live in dire poverty. So, yeah.
So, okay, now I know you were talking about the psychopaths, and the psychopaths are in charge. And it seems, as I remember reading your book, you talk about why that they have, you know, they have that ethic to work hard, to not care about anybody else, and all the rest of it. So how do we change that? What mode is there to stop the psychopaths raising up the chain, up the greasy pole so fast, so that more ethical people can be in charge and make a difference?
Again, a very complicated answer with lots of different parts. Now, in the case of politics, I would argue there's a number of changes which need to happen to the political system. So one of these changes is that on every ballot paper, there should be an option for either nota or RON. So RON, reopen nominations, RON, nota, none of the above. So let's say, for example, I'm from York Inner. There's two York constituencies, York Inner, York Outer. Now, in the York Inner constituency, I think last time there was Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats and Green. I think there was 4 candidates. There might have been an independent, I can't remember now. But let's say for the sake of argument that there's 4. There should always be a 5th option, none of the above.
Right. And that isn't the case.
And that isn't the case in the UK. It is the case in some countries, but it's
right.
quite rare. And it's often the case, you know, some student unions have this. I think at York University, they had this on some of their ballots for, you know, student representatives. Now, the thing with none of the above is, let's say at the last election in York, there was somewhere around 60 to 70% of people who were eligible to vote actually voted. So that leaves like 30, 32, 33%, something like that, of people, about a third of the electorate, not voting. Now, why aren't they voting? Well, one of the reasons is because they're very disillusioned. Now, if there was an option of none of the above on the ballot paper, they would be able to go and vote for none of the above. And if none of the above wins, then nobody is elected.
Is that the same, or what is the difference then between that and spoiling the ballot?
Well, spoiled ballots are counted as spoilt ballots, but someone is still elected.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even if there's 4 candidates and 10 people turn up to vote, someone still gets elected. It's not a case of a minimum threshold in the system that we have at the moment. So there is always someone elected, no matter how many people do or don't turn up to vote.
So what happens then if you have none of the above, nobody is elected? What happens to government then?
Okay, well, let's say everyone turns up to vote in my constituency of York, 100% of people, and those 30% who don't normally vote, they all vote for none of the above, and then the next candidate gets 29% of the vote, so none of the above is in the first past the post system wins. Well, there's a number of possible options. One is there is no MP for that seat, right? That's one possible option. Another is that another election is held with new candidates. So none of the candidates who originally stand are allowed to stand a second time. Or it could be the case whereby names are put in a hat and you pick someone at random, right? Sortition, right? Which is another one of the solutions that I talk about in my book. I have a video on it on my YouTube channel. Random selection by lot. It was used by the ancient Greeks as well as democratic voting. But the point is, politicians are not afraid of the electorate because they know that no matter how bad they all are, and I mean, you know, I've never voted Conservative in my life. I would never vote Conservative. I've voted Labour in the past in some elections, and I think in some local elections I've voted Liberal, Democrat or Green. But I don't feel that any of the candidates at the moment represent my political views. I don't want to vote for Starmer. I don't want to vote for Richie Sunak. But whether I do or do not want to vote for one of these people, someone is going to be elected in my constituency because there isn't the none of the above option. And I think we need to keep politicians afraid of the electorate, I mean, maybe afraid's not quite the right word, but they know that no matter how corrupt and useless and narcissistic they are, one of them is going to get elected.
Do you feel that the politicians, the MPs, understand the concept that they are supposedly working for us as opposed to us working for them?
I think as a general rule, no. I think there are some honourable exceptions. Now, in York Inner, the constituency I normally live in, my constituency MP, I've got a lot of respect for her. I've been a number of times to see her about particular issues. And as an individual, I respect her because I think she is dedicated to serving her local constituency. However, I think she's the exception. You know, there are some MPs like this. I don't know what percent. I mean, if I was to hazard a guess, I'd say something like 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 are driven by a desire to serve the public. But I have to say, I think the majority of MPs, certainly at least 3/4, are driven by a personal desire for power and, you know, access to power, money, you know, all those kind of things that drive a certain type of person.
What happens if nobody votes at all?
What indeed? Well, I think there would be some kind of crisis.
I mean, we have the two-party system, which you could probably not even get a fag paper between the two because they seem to be two arses from the same cheek.
Yeah.
Two cheeks from the same arse. I had to think about that. But they are pretty much the same. There is no shadowing of the current government, really, other than wanting more.
Right.
And we saw that through the year of 2020 and so on. If people, and I know there's independence potentially, but the chances of getting sufficient independence in to really make a difference. But if people just do not vote, they say, look, the system is so broken that I just do not want any of them telling me what to do. And people en masse, which of course is, you know, unlikely. But if they did, stayed at home, didn't vote, would that be a tipping point to then start talking about, you know, actually having a public consultation on not the system we have.
It might be, but I mean,
because ultimately, if all you say in this book is great and marvellous, we've got to get there.
We have got to get there.
And having it as a theory or an ideal is one thing, but people are desperate. And we've seen a dictatorial government, we've seen tyranny, and we've talked about the digital IDs coming and CBDCs. We've actually got to do something, and you present lots of ideas in here, but ultimately I just know people will be going, that's great, but how do we do it? What's the steps? Because everybody wants to play a part.
Right. Well, I've got an idea of what some of the steps are. Now, standing, some kind of, let's say, anti-establishment alliance, putting candidates in seats might work. Now, I think if you can get the people out who don't vote to vote, you can have a whole new party with perhaps even a majority. Doubtful, I know, but I mean, I think it is possible. So there is that political route, but I don't know. I mean, it's a tricky one. I mean, I think some of the changes, you have to start working on yourself.
Yes.
Get a meditation routine, go jogging. But you're right.
I mean, if we're constantly being put upon by psychopaths, which we are, and it's not helped that not only is government acting that way, but also the corporations are acting that way. Individuals going about their business, just trying to put food on the table, educate the kids the best way they can, hold on to property, and have something to look forward to. It does seem that we are losing the optimism. And in your book, you're effectively saying, there's a utopia out there if we follow these things or think about these things. Because I suppose part of what you're saying is we've got to think about these things first. Otherwise, you can't get to something you don't know exists.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important that we have alternative narratives, because one of the things being told to us by the World Economic Forum is we're going to have a great reset. There's going to be a new normal. Now, on that point, I actually think that they're right. We do need a great reset. We do need a new normal, right? I agree with them on that, although I completely disagree with them on what it should entail. Now, they've imagined something. They've imagined this dystopian future, and they're telling us there is no alternative. So one of the things that we need is stories, narratives that can challenge that. Because if they tell us there is no alternative and enough people believe it, it will happen.
Yeah.
Now,
and we see that with the global warming narrative.
Right. And we see it with all sorts of different narratives. There is no alternative. This is the way it is. You've just got to accept it.
Fixed.
Right. So partly it's about imagining a different world. So, which is what I do in the book. I've imagined a different world. Now, exactly how we get there, it's like, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Right.
So I don't think we need to know all of the steps.
Right.
But
okay.
I think we do need to know the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's say.
I've pressured you on how do we get there, but actually listening and having this discussion has made me aware, really, that actually you're quite right there. You don't need to necessarily know the complete answer at this moment. But unless you imagine those ideas...
Right.
Unless you've got those goals to go, that people can then either demand them or just say, well, sod you lot, we're going to go and do them, as we've seen with people starting to grow their own, boycotting supermarkets, deciding to not perhaps work for big corporations, but setting up their own independent businesses, setting up their own trust funds and protecting property, all the myriad of ways that people can do it. basically taking back responsibility for themselves.
Yes.
Rather than being a child of the state.
Right. Now, something that you said to me earlier was your podcast, you're planting seeds, right? So I think a lot of it is about planting seeds. Now, the World Economic Forum, they've envisaged what they want, right? And of course, they have a lot of money behind them, so they can afford to pay people to make snazzy little videos and you know, to have these pictures of how your 15-minute city will look, or, you know, what London is going to be like when it's completely surveilled. I mean, it's already more or less completely surveilled.
That sounds enticing, doesn't it?
Yeah, but they've imagined their dystopia and they've given it form in a certain respect. Now, we need anyone who's opposed to that and who doesn't want to live in a dystopia. First of all, we need to imagine that that is not an inevitability, and it's not an inevitability. So, for example, one of the chapters in my book, I talk about non-state forms, right, which are communities of 5,000 people or less, often called intentional communities, eco-villages, and
non-state forms, so they're
yes,
not forms of the state.
So they're not.
Right.
They're not forms of the state. So anarchist communes. So a lot of this relates to anarchist thinking,
Which
now,
is self-rule.
Which is self-rule.
Just to make that, because some people think of anarchy as
just lobbing plants through people's windows and such like. Not that kind of anarchy. But let's imagine a small community of like 60 people, or maybe 144 people. Now, there's a lot of advantages you can realise by living in a small community. So let's say there's 60 people and you have a beef with someone else in the community. Now, you're either going to know that person directly or you're going to know someone who knows them. So dispute resolution can be done in a very personal way.
Right.
So there is no need for a police with a legal monopoly on violence, and there's no need for a formalised government.
Right.
Now,
and you can use your peers, like in the old common law of trial by jury, a
right,
jury of your peers who can work out that dispute, who was in the right, who was in the wrong, and actually should that law ever been invented in the first place.
Right. Now, particularly if you have communities less than 150, which is known as Dunbar's number. So Dunbar's number, named for Professor Robin Dunbar of Durham University. So he says, and this is related to the size of the human neocortex, that you will never be able to personally know more than 150 people.
Right.
So if you imagine a community that's smaller than 150, you can actually know everyone else in that community.
Yeah.
So you don't need a police force. Now, it might be that at some time people get into fights. So particularly young men between the age of, let's say, 15 and 30. This is the group that is responsible for most actual violence in the world, right? And, you know, people drink. Spontaneous, right. But there's a difference between spontaneous violence and violence for money.
Yeah.
Right, a hitman or, you know, a war, right, you know. And obviously some people, Tony Blair, such people, do very well out of wars.
They've made
right?
a killing,
some people do
you could say.
Some people make a killing. So these small communities, and they do exist. There are people doing this out there, and you know they've written books on it. So there are these examples.
It reminds me, if you go back in time, to Neolithic hill forts and communities, which were more than your, I don't know, 50 or 60 just people, but a hill fort of say 100 or 200 people, who would, early villages in a way, who would know each other, and they resolve everything because they are a unit.
Right.
And that unit over there, heaven forbid they come over here and try and nick our cattle, because we collectively are all the same. Right. And we will protect our, hence the palisades and the earthworks and stuff.
Yeah. So this also relates to social capital, which I talked about earlier.
Right.
When you know everyone and the bonds in the community are strong, social capital is nurtured.
Right.
Now, one of my problems with capitalism is basically they ignore social capital or try to pretend that it's not real, right? But it is. This is the basis of societies. Now, if you have 150 people or less, if you have some big issue that needs to be sorted out in the community, everyone can have their say. People can stand up, make their point for 10 minutes or whatever, and, everyone can do that.
So this is interesting, because we have seen eroded, and I make this point many times, as it occurred to me several months ago. We used to have local newspapers, we used to have local radio stations, and it used to be about the community we're in. Communities, towns have got bigger, villages have got bigger, cities are vast. And because of that, you don't know anybody other than perhaps, the person next door. Heaven forbid, people don't know their neighbours anymore. And families, because of work, have been atomised here, there and all over the place. So that system, are you saying, is actually part of the problem?
Mostly, yes. Yes, it is mostly part of the problem. Now, I lived for 5 years in Bangkok. I was an English language teacher, and I also lived for 6 months in Mexico City because I did Latin American studies at university, and, I was a year abroad in Mexico. Now, I would have to say, from my experience of living in megacities, is they were not created for humans.
Right.
They were created for the needs of capitalism. But, I wouldn't live in a megacity ever again. I've been there, done that. Now, I would go back and visit, but I wouldn't want to stay there.
So Tri-City that they're trying to make in the Netherlands, in which they're trying to hoard people into one places, and some of these, although they're calling them 15-minute communities, and the line that's in, where is that, Saudi, is it?
Yes, yeah.
Which is decompartmentalised 15-minute cities, but effectively joined together, clearly seems chaos.
That's about control.
Yes.
That's about control.
And you're saying...
I'm talking about autonomous communities.
Absolutely. And the thing is, what is the thing? Again, how do we get there? Step by step by step, by envisaging...
Okay, so part of it is just knowing that people have done it and it is a possibility.
Yes.
Right? Because, so in the anthropological literature, they talk about 4 types of human group size. So there's a band, which is between about 6 and 60 people, a tribe, which is maybe 60 to 300, a chieftain, which is more or less 500 to 5,000, and then a state at around 10 to 15,000 or more. Now, as things stand, pretty much everyone on planet Earth lives under the control of a state. There are no longer any non-state forms. Now, perhaps in certain parts of Papua New Guinea or the Namib Desert, there are people who live outside of the control of the state. But if they want to travel anywhere internationally, they fall under the control of the state. Now, historically, humans evolved 200 to 250,000 years ago. And, the mainstream historical and archaeological narrative, if there were no high states. Now, of course, there's Plato's story of Atlantis, so they might be wrong, but let's assume for the sake of the argument that they're correct. Well, what that means is for, 97, 98% of human history, all humans lived in non-state forms. Bands, tribes, and chieftains of a maximum of 5,000 people. Well, surely, if humans lived for, more than 200,000 years in non-state forms without state, there must be comparative advantages available to us by living in those. Now, my argument as a post-capitalist is we need both. We need states and we need non-states forms. So for me, the anarchist argument breaks down when you get to 10 to 15,000 people. Now, if you have 15,000 people, you need a formalised police force with a legal monopoly on violence, and you need a bureaucratic system. Now, I would say the main argument in favour of a police force with a legal monopoly on violence is the fear of violence of strangers. Now, that can be imagined or it can be real because, people do suffer real violence randomly,
yes,
daily. It's uncommon, but it does happen. But if you get 15,000 people or more, you do need a state. But One of the issues with the state, and this argument is made by a lot of anarchist and libertarian thinkers, is dark triad personality types, so dark triad, psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, these types of people will always attempt to seize control of the state because they want to do all sorts of nefarious activities, and if they're in positions of power, they can get away with them. If they're not in positions of power, they'll get caught and thrown in prison. So on that level, it's kind of like a no-brainer.
And so this is something that I've often spoken about. Again, small is best, keeping things small. We're running out of time on this, and also I want people to have an opportunity to read your book and understand all of the bits in it. It's full of great ideas. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and if you felt like this was a complicated conversation, please be assured that the book, and I don't get any payback for this, and I'm a very simple man really, it's a great read and it makes sense. And you reference lots of different things. You reference one book in particular called Cradle to Cradle, which I just thought was an amazing approach that they have, in which they said if you wanted to build what we have now with industry, the Industrial Revolution, I think the example you use, if you want to, and they go through what you would have to do to create the chaos that we have now. And then you think, well, if that's the plan, no one would ever have created it.
Absolutely.
But that is what we've got. And so that's what I love about your book. You're referencing lots of stuff so that if you're thirsty for knowledge, you can go and find more as well. So there it is. Go and check it out. The link will be in the description. Alasdair, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you. Can I just say my final point?
Yes.
So, as I said before, I was an English language teacher. I'm currently in the process of creating my first online course that I'm going to be offering later this month. So if you'd like a toolkit in sustained personal change, have a look at my website, which will be in the description box, alasdairlord.co.uk. Go and have a look, and I'm launching it this month.
Fantastic. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
We need more of that, ideas and positive steps to getting out of the situation we're in. So thank you so much for watching. Hope it's been of interest. It's been absolutely fantastic down here in South Gloucestershire on this wonderful day.
Yes.
Alasdair, thank you for agreeing to be my guest.
Thanks very much, Richard. My pleasure.
And until next time, thank you for watching and goodbye.